buried shadows. I woke to the sound of my own ragged breathing, the stifling weight of earth pressing against me. My arms flailed, meeting only cold, damp soil as panic clawed its way through my chest. My mind was a blank canvas, smeared only with the vivid terror of being buried alive. I thrashed, kicking, digging upwards with a desperate urgency, the air growing thinner with every frantic breath. My nails scraped against rocks and roots, snapping painfully as the soil clogged my throat and nostrils. Just as the darkness began to tighten its grip, my hand broke through to a cool, open space. With one final burst of strength, I clawed my way out, collapsing onto the ground as the night air filled my lungs. The world spun around me. The sky was an ink-black void scattered with pinpricks of stars, but even their light seemed distant and cold. I lay there trembling, dirt clinging to my skin, my chest heaving with relief and confusion. Where was I? The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a bone-deep chill and the faint smell of decay. I rose shakily to my feet, my legs quivering beneath me, and looked around. The landscape was unfamiliar. Gnarled trees stretched like skeletal fingers toward the heavens, their twisted branches casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. A narrow dirt path snaked through the forest, faintly illuminated by the sickly glow of a crescent moon. I followed it, drawn forward by some instinct I couldn't name. My clothes were tattered, stained with soil, but I hardly noticed. My mind was an empty slate save for one thought: find someone. Anyone. The path led me to a small, desolate town, nestled in a hollow of shadow and fog. The buildings were old, their wooden facades warped and weathered, and the streets were eerily silent. No lights shone in the windows, no voices drifted through the air. It was as though the place had been abandoned long ago, yet I felt eyes on me, watching, waiting. Help! My voice was a hoarse rasp, barely audible over the sound of my footsteps on the cobblestones. I approached the first house I saw and knocked on the door. The sound echoed hollowly, but no one answered. I moved on to the next house, then another, my desperation mounting with each silent door. Finally, I turned a corner and saw a figure, a man, standing in the middle of the road. He was hunched, his shoulders rigid, and as I called out to him, he flinched but didn't turn. "Please," I said, my voice cracking. "I need help. I don't know where I am." The man turned slowly and I froze. His face was pale and lined with fear, his eyes wide and glistening in the moonlight. "You," he whispered, his voice trembling. He took a step back, then another. "You're not supposed to be here." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, but he didn't answer. Instead, he turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty streets. The man's words hung heavy in the air, chilling me more than the cold night ever could. I stood rooted to the spot, the echoes of his retreating footsteps fading into silence. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse again. "You're not supposed to be here." The phrase repeated in my mind like a mantra as I stumbled through the deserted town. The oppressive silence weighed on me, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind through broken shutters. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man following me, but the street was empty. I spotted a faint glow up ahead, emanating from what looked like a tavern. The sign above the door swung on rusted hinges, the painted letters faded and barely legible. The hollow lantern. With no better options, I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp on the bar, its flame flickering like it too wanted to escape. A handful of people sat at scattered tables, their faces turned away as I entered. Conversations ceased mid-sentence, and the air grew heavier with an unspoken tension. "Excuse me," I said, stepping toward the bar. My voice sounded foreign to me, like it belonged to someone else. I need help. I don't know what's happening. The barkeep, a burly man with a grizzled beard, looked up from polishing a glass. His eyes narrowed as they met mine, and the glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. "It can't be," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He took a step back, his expression shifting from shock to something darker. "You're supposed to be dead." The room erupted into whispers. "It's him. He's back. How is this possible?" "I don't understand," I stammered, my chest tightening with panic. "What do you mean?" The barkeep's gaze hardened. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here again, after everything." "After what?" My voice rose, desperation seeping into every word. "I don't even know who I am."
A forest where shadows come to life and hunt intruders. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it had become. The kind of quiet that presses in, smothering the small, comforting sounds of the world. The hum of insects, the rustle of wind through leaves, even the distant hoot of an owl. It wasn't normal, that silence. But I told myself it was nothing. It was dusk, and the last embers of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the narrow hiking path. I had taken this trail before, always staying clear of the branching paths that disappeared into the darker parts of the forest. Locals called it the Forbidden Forest, though no one could explain why. It was just one of those stories that settled into the bones of a town, passed down through whispers and warnings. Don't go in too deep, don't wander too far. But tonight, something felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, their edges softer, blurring where they shouldn't. And then there was the light. At first, I thought it was a firefly, a fleeting golden flicker hovering just off the trail. But it didn't move like one. It pulsed, brightening and dimming rhythmically, like a distant lantern swaying in the wind. My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the trail, pushing through the underbrush, drawn toward the glow. The forest changed as I went deeper. The trees seemed closer, their twisted branches weaving together like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, the kind of chill that raises goosebumps on your skin even when you're bundled up. The ground beneath my boots felt wrong, too soft, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. When I reached the clearing, the light disappeared. I stopped, my chest tight with the realization that the forest behind me had vanished. Where there had been a faintly worn path just minutes ago, there was now only dense, impenetrable trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite myself. It echoed strangely, as if the trees themselves were mocking me. That's when I saw them, the shadows. At first I thought they were just the product of the fading light, stretched long and unnatural by the setting sun. But they didn't behave the way shadows should. They moved independently, shifting across the ground and trees in ways that defied the wind or the angle of light. One of them seemed to ripple, its edges undulating like something alive. A twig snapped behind me, and I spun around. There, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, were people. Or at least, I thought they were people. 4 of them, grouped together, their faces pale and taut with fear. "Hey!" I called out, relief washing over me. "I think I'm lost." "Shh," one of them hissed, a man with hollow eyes that darted nervously from tree to tree. "Don't speak so loudly, they'll hear you." "Who?" I asked, stepping closer. The woman nearest to him, her face streaked with dirt and tears, whispered hoarsely, "The shadows." I laughed nervously, the sound breaking awkwardly in the oppressive silence. "Shadows? You're joking, right?" The man turned to me, his face pale as bone. "Do we look like we're joking?" Before I could respond, something moved in the corner of my vision. A dark, sinuous shape slithering across the ground toward us. It stretched and expanded, growing taller, twisting into something vaguely humanoid. My breath hitched as its form solidified. A figure, impossibly black, standing against the dim backdrop of the forest. Its limbs were elongated, its edges flickering like fire caught in a windless room. One of the hikers, a younger man with a face etched in panic, grabbed my arm. "Run," he whispered harshly. But the shadow was already moving, gliding toward us with unnatural grace. We ran, or at least we tried to. The forest resisted us at every step. The roots seemed to shift beneath my feet, snaring my ankles, while the branches above closed in tighter, their skeletal fingers snagging my hair and jacket. The air grew colder, heavier, and each breath felt like inhaling ice shards. Ahead of me, the hikers weaved through the maze of trees, their panicked movements barely visible in the dim light. I wanted to call out, to ask where we were going, but my throat felt constricted, my voice strangled by the oppressive silence of the forest. Then I saw it again. The shadow was faster than it should have been, gliding effortlessly over the uneven ground, closing the distance between us. As it moved, it changed shape, twisting and bending in impossible ways. For a fleeting moment, it looked almost human, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. "Don't stop!" one of the hikers yelled, his voice laced with raw terror. I stumbled into a clearing, my lungs burning and my legs trembling. The others had stopped, forming a tight circle. Their faces were ghostly pale, their eyes wide with fear. "Why did you stop?" I asked, gasping for air.
The door to the tavern creaked open behind me, and a cold draft swept through the room. I turned to see the elderly man who had run from me earlier. He stepped inside, his face ashen, and pointed a trembling finger at me. "Tell me this," he said, his voice quaking. "How many times must you die before you stay buried?" His words hit me like a blow to the chest. My breath caught as fragmented images flashed through my mind, hands clawing at dirt, a coffin lid slamming shut, faces staring down at me with expressions of horror and pity. I stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the bar to steady myself. The room seemed to tilt, the whispers of the patrons rising to a deafening crescendo. "I don't understand," I whispered. But deep down, I felt the horrifying truth clawing its way to the surface. This wasn't the first time I'd risen from the grave, and it might not be the last. The barkeep's words gnawed at me as I stumbled out of the tavern and into the empty streets. "How many times must you die before you stay buried?" The phrase circled my mind, refusing to let go. The cold seemed sharper now, the darkness deeper. The few faces I glimpsed through cracked shutters disappeared as soon as I met their gaze. Whispers floated from unseen corners, voices low and urgent. They spoke of me as though I was both a threat and a curse. I wandered aimlessly until I found myself at the edge of a graveyard. The iron gate loomed before me, its spikes glinting under the pale moonlight. Something about the place called to me, a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. The gate creaked open with a reluctant groan, and I stepped inside. Rows of headstones stretched out before me, their inscriptions worn and crumbling. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. I walked among the graves, scanning the names etched into the stones. A part of me feared what I might find, but another part, the part desperate for answers, drove me forward. And then I saw it. My knees buckled as I read the name carved into the weathered stone. Ian Talbot. My name. Below it were 2 dates, my birth date and my death date. Multiple times. There were 3 separate entries, each separated by years. Each one marked a death. Each one marked a return. I staggered backward, bile rising in my throat. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This can't be real." "It's real," a voice rasped behind me. I spun around to see a frail woman standing a few paces away. Her hunched frame was cloaked in tattered black, her face etched with deep lines that spoke of pain and wisdom. Her eyes glinted in the moonlight, sharp and unyielding. "You've come back," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made the air around her seem heavier. "Just as you always do. Who are you?" My voice trembled. She stepped closer, her cane tapping softly against the ground. "Eleanor," she said, "the keeper of secrets no one wants to remember." "What's happening to me?" I demanded. Why is my name on that grave? Why does everyone look at me like I'm some kind of monster? Eleanor's gaze pierced through me. Because they know what you are, and deep down, so do you. I shook my head, fear twisting in my chest. I don't know anything. I woke up in a grave. That's all I know. Her lips pressed into a thin line. The town is cursed, Ian, and you're part of it. You've always been part of it. She motioned for me to follow her. Come, there are things you need to see. Eleanor led me to her home, a decrepit cottage on the edge of the graveyard. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of herbs and dust. Candles flickered on every surface, their light casting long, dancing shadows. She handed me a book, its leather cover cracked with age, and gestured for me to sit. This, she said, is the truth. I opened the book with trembling hands. Its pages were filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. The ink faded, but legible. The entries detailed the history of the town, my town, apparently. But the story was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. The curse had begun centuries ago, when a terrible sickness swept through the hollow. Desperate for salvation, the townsfolk turned to a ritual they barely understood, a plea to something dark and ancient. A bargain was struck. The town would be spared, but a scapegoat would bear the cost. That scapegoat, according to the records, was me. You were the first, Eleanor said. Chosen for reasons lost to time, sacrificed to save the town. But the deal was flawed. Instead of passing on, your soul was bound to this place, to the ritual. I stared at her, my chest tightening. What does that mean? That I can't die? She nodded. Not truly. Every few decades, when the town is threatened, you return to take their sins upon yourself, and then you die again. The weight of her words crushed me. How do I stop it? She hesitated, her expression grim. To break the curse, you'd have to destroy the entity that holds the town in its grasp. But it won't let you go easily, and it won't let the town go at all. Eleanor armed me with the little she could. A handful of runes etched into cold iron, a vial of consecrated oil, and a warning. It will know you're coming. It will try to break you. The abandoned church stood at the center of town, its silhouette jagged and broken against the night sky. Its bell tower leaned precariously, the once proud structure now a monument to decay. As I approached, the air grew heavier, colder, charged with an unnatural energy. The whispers began again, louder now, echoing in my mind like the scraping of nails on glass. You don't have to do this, the whispers cooed. You could leave, forget, fade. I ignored them, pushing open the church doors. They groaned loudly, the sound reverberating through the hollow interior. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot and mildew. Pews lay scattered like broken bones, and the altar was draped in shadows that seemed to move on their own. At the center of the nave stood a figure. It was shrouded in darkness, its form flickering like a dying flame. Its eyes burned with a sickly yellow light, and its voice slithered into my mind. You dare defy the cycle? I stepped forward, gripping the iron rune tightly. I'm ending this, I said, my voice firm despite the fear gnawing at me. No more sacrifices. The entity laughed, a sound like shattering glass. You think you can fight me? You, who belong to me? It lunged, a mass of shadow and fury, its form twisting as it struck. I raised the rune, the iron burning bright as it connected. The creature recoiled, its scream tearing through the church and shaking the walls. But it wasn't finished, and neither was I. The final battle had begun. The church trembled as the entity's scream faded into a low, guttural growl. Shadows pulsed around it, stretching and writhing like living tendrils, warping the air with their unnatural motion. The yellow glow of its eyes burned brighter, filled with malice that seemed to seep into my bones. "You cannot undo what has been done," it hissed, its voice layered with countless whispers. "You are bound to me, Ian. You have always been mine." I tightened my grip on the iron rune, the edges biting into my palm. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I forced myself to hold steady. "Not anymore," I said, though my voice wavered. "This ends tonight." The entity surged forward, its shadowy limbs lashing out. I dove to the side, the air around me growing icy as one of the tendrils grazed my arm. Pain flared where it touched, like frostbite spreading beneath my skin. I stumbled but stayed on my feet, fumbling for the vial of consecrated oil Eleanor had given me. The shadows writhed, closing in as the entity circled me, its form shifting with each step. One moment, it resembled a cloaked figure. The next, it was an amorphous mass of smoke and flickering light. Its presence filled the room, oppressive and suffocating. "You think you can destroy me," it mocked. "I am the bargain. I am the lifeblood of this hollow. Without me, they will crumble, and you will perish alongside them." I ignored its words, unscrewing the vial with trembling hands. "Better to die free than live under your shadow." The entity roared, the sound shaking loose pieces of the ceiling. Chunks of plaster rained down, but I pressed forward, dashing the oil in a wide arc around me. The liquid hissed as it hit the ground, forming a faint barrier of shimmering light. The entity recoiled, its shadows twisting wildly, but it didn't retreat. "You cannot escape," it snarled. "The cycle will continue. It always does." I reached the altar, where an ancient chalice sat, tarnished and forgotten. Eleanor's words rang in my mind. "Use the oil to mark the altar. Bind it to the runes. Only then can you sever its hold." I dipped my fingers into the last of the oil, tracing the sigils Eleanor had taught me onto the chalice. The room darkened further, the air thick with the entity's rage. A tendril lashed out, shattering a pew beside me, splinters raining down like shards of bone. "You dare defy me!" it shrieked, its voice fractured and furious. The final rune burned bright as I completed the sequence. The light spread from the chalice, racing across the altar and into the air, carving through the shadows like a blade. The entity howled, its form breaking apart into fragments of darkness. Its tendrils writhed wildly, striking at the barrier of light, but it was too late. The runes ignited, the light coalescing into a blinding flash that filled the church. The entity screamed, its voice splintering into countless echoes as its form disintegrated, scattering into the void. For a moment there was silence. Then the air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting as the last of the shadows faded. I collapsed onto the cold stone floor, my chest heaving. The chalice lay shattered, its purpose fulfilled, and the room was bathed in the pale light of dawn creeping through the broken windows. The hollow's curse was broken. But I wasn't free. As I stepped out of the church, the world felt strangely quiet, the town frozen in a moment of uneasy calm. The streets were empty, the buildings lifeless. I felt no triumph, only an eerie stillness that gnawed at my mind. The graveyard awaited me, its iron gate creaking in the morning breeze. My steps dragged as I approached my headstone. The earth around it was undisturbed now, no signs of the upheaval from which I had emerged. But the gravestone had changed. The dates, the marks of my deaths, were gone, replaced by a single word carved into the weathered stone. Free. I should have felt relief, but unease settled deep in my gut. I turned away, only to stop short. In the distance, beneath the gnarled trees at the edge of the graveyard, a figure stood motionless. Cloaked in shadows, it stared at me with glowing yellow eyes. A chill crept up my spine as I realized the truth. The cycle was broken, but something had been unleashed, something darker than before, and it was waiting. The story wasn't over. Not for me, not for the town, and perhaps not for anyone.